told me like 2 months ago that he's coming to Israel, I immediately asked him, would you come and do kind of a fire side chat with me? Because the whole issue of PLG and pricing models and different distribution models is something that we've been dealing a lot with our companies in the last 2 years. There were actually a lot of challenges that rose, and I really wanted to ask Mackie some questions about it and kind of get his advice, as he's really one of the pioneers in this space. So let's start by, Mackie, if you can just introduce yourself. We're going to have like 30 minutes of me asking Mackie questions, and then we're going to open it to you guys. I'm sure you have tons of questions to ask him as well.
Well, first of all, whenever you ask me just about anything, my answer is absolutely, I will be there. So thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. So Mackie Craven, I'm a partner at OpenView. I've been at OpenView for about 10 years. Just a quick background on the firm. We only invest in software, no biotech, no crypto, no scooters, so pretty straightforward. I tend to spend most of my time with products that are either built or built for technical end users. So this is things selling to developers like a Datadog or a Logs.io. In the cybersecurity realm, businesses like Exonius, in IT operations or more traditional IT, things like JumpCloud. The rest of the firm is more broadly application software focused. So businesses like a Calendly or an Expensify or a HighSpot. And Israel's been a fantastic geography for us. First investment we made here was in 2016, and pre-quarantine I would come about 3 or 4 times a year. I'm trying to get back to it. So I was here in November, here now, I'll be back in June. But thank you so much for having me, and PLG is a topic that we at OpenView love, partially because you always love your babies and it's a term we created. So excited to answer questions, to talk about it, and most importantly, hopefully this is at least not dramatically less interesting than the conversations that were happening here in the room. I think it's a really fantastic group, so thank you for coming out.
So the first question that I want to ask you is, can you define for us what is PLG? Because I'm meeting a lot of startups that are claiming that they're doing PLG, and they're doing very different things, actually.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. It's come to mean a lot of things. So if we go back in time, really to 2015, 2016, we were seeing a number of things in our portfolio companies that didn't look like the behavior either internally in how they were building product or how they were going to market that we thought was sort of definitional for a software company. And there were various collections of practices, and eventually we came together and said, okay, there's something here. There's something more cohesive. Let's think about it. Let's think about what the integrating principles are, and let's call it something. And at its core, what we came to, what we think of as PLG, or at least the origin of it, is to go-to-market philosophy. It's a product philosophy. And in principle, it's about using the product as the primary mechanism for your go-to-market. Instead of a human at the company, the product that you've built to either acquire, retain, grow users and customers. That's a very general statement. Right? There are a lot of ways to execute that, depending on the product category that you might be in, the behavior of the specific customers or users. And I think that's one of the things that we see where someone says, I'm PLG, that can be radically different business models today in terms of how they price, they go to market. But the basic principle, again, is how do you de-labor the sales process, the customer success process, the account management process, and let the product do as much of that work as possible for your user base or for your customer.
Okay, thanks. And so let's talk a little bit about the different go-to-market, and then maybe about the different pricing models. And I want to shortly discuss kind of the self-serve model, which a lot of our companies tried. I must admit that some of them failed and got back to direct. So first of all, ask you about, have you seen that? What are the challenges? Why are some companies failing? And maybe then we'll talk about open source as well, which is another interesting way.
Absolutely. PLG is really hard. Let's just start with that. And it's certainly not an approach that is necessarily right for every business, right for every product market, right for every user or buyer set. Right? If we go back to that principle of the goal in some senses is to deliver it, it's also to make it as easy as possible for the user or the buyer to go through that journey. So if they actually expect to have their hand held, versus given who they are in the organization or the way that they're used to buying or using things, versus someone who wants to get their hands dirty, PLG might not be a great approach. I think the other challenge to it, which is also one of the benefits, it's a double-edged sword, is that the model fundamentally is more exponential than linear or quadratic. So what I mean by that, right, is whether one user is having a product interaction or 10 users or 10,000 or a million users, assuming you've built a scalable enough backend, their experience should be pretty similar. But someone's interaction with a first salesperson or a 10th salesperson or a 100th salesperson is going to be pretty darn different. And the trick with exponential functions is they look flat, right, when you look backwards, and they look vertical when you look forwards. And that flat period can be very long, right? So one of the challenges with product-led growth is it is fundamentally more organic. The product and the usage characteristics create a behavioral pattern that then has a very strong influence over how fast you can grow. On the flip side, if you're building an inside sales team and you've proven that model works with 1 or 2 reps, you control the lever, right? You have a much clearer input-output relationship to be able to put capital to work, bring people on, and actually grow your business faster. So one of the challenges that we see in the self-serve model in particular is you can set it up, it can work, and the fundamental growth rate, while it might be exponential, might be 60%. And 60% on 100K isn't going to get you very far. That 60% might be the same when you're 100 million, but that doesn't help you at the early stage. And so I agree. It completely depends on the nature of the buyer and the way that the product is set up.
Yeah, and when we talked, you also told me before, we were I was cheating. He told me some things. He told me that it's really important with self-serve, specifically that people will understand the problem and will agree on the solution. Otherwise, it's going to be very, very hard actually to sell it to them.
I think that's exactly right. So part of the thing with self-serve is there's these 2 components. One, somebody's out looking for something. They're in Google, they're searching, they're asking their friend, they're talking about, they're venting over a problem they have. So the product that you have generally needs to be associated with a known problem. It's a way to solve it. And then 2, the way that you're solving it generally has to be something they already understand, something they wish they could do or are doing, but it's too hard, because it's much, much harder through a product to teach someone something new or to be evangelical, right? It doesn't build a human connection. And so if you need to change a human's behavior or desired behavior to use the product, it's much more challenging to do that in a self-serve way than if they know they have the problem and they know how they want to solve the problem. Either wasn't possible before or there was too much friction, and now you make it easy. It's in those models where we see certainly the fastest growth early on in self-serve product-led model.
And let's talk about open source for a minute and then go back to self-serve, because it's the same issue. Also, with open source companies, we see that it takes a long time to build a community. Even if it's successful, even if you look at the most successful examples in the open source, usually it takes like 3 years to build a community. And is that a viable model for VC investments?
Yeah, again, a great question. I think when we look at a lot of the open source businesses that have gone public, particularly if we look at sort of the enterprise infrastructure companies, those that are familiar with the solutions know that, yeah, they may have been an open source project for 2 or 4 years while that person was still working in the organization that they created the open source for. They had time for a community to be built, to become robust, and to actually start getting used in enterprise deployments before they went out, founded a company, built an additional proprietary product, and then started selling, which is a tremendous advantage versus founding a company and creating an open source project at the same time, right? Because if that project is just as successful, you're still waiting 2 years, 3 years, 4 years before you see the kind of bang that, let's say, a Confluent or GitLab or some of these other companies saw. It's not one-to-one. And so, the question of, okay, is it viable for a VC model or for VC funding? I think it depends on your own constitution a little bit as an entrepreneur and what you want to do and how you want to do it and the partners that you have. Because I think it's important to go in eyes wide open that if you want to build an open source business that truly is focused on the community and grows that way, like the self-serve model, it's an organic process. You can make it faster, but you can't just sort of force it to happen in half the time, versus businesses that leverage open source, but almost purely as a go-to-market tactic, right? Which is a different approach. You're building a Terra product, but you want to gain legitimacy. You want to look for ease of use. You want to avoid vendor lock-in. Like, that's fine, right? You're still building a software company that has an open source component. And so to me, those two are very different in terms of both the way that you would structure the product, but also what one's expectation should be about how fast you can generate revenue and how fast that the community can mature.
Another model that we've started to see recently, and I'm not sure it's really working, is that direct sales of kind of closed product companies are developing an open source on the side with kind of the ambition or the hope that they can monetize it and integrate it into the solution, when usually it's kind of kept as a side business. Have you seen that model working? Is it worthwhile? I'm not sure even if it's working on the marketing side.
Yeah, so it's interesting. The question is, why is open source valuable, right? Open source tends to be valuable because, one, sometimes you get a pre-seeded community, you get pre-validation that this is the right technical solution, you get social proof. Given what we discussed about the time it takes typically to build these communities, to build trust, to do so in an authentic way, often if it is an afterthought or if it's something that comes later, your expectations already about being a commercial company, how fast you want to grow, it's unlikely for the open source to be able to have a material impact on your expectations because you have the same cold start problem. You still have to wait often multiple years for it to take hold.
Okay, and last question is about kind of like the business models. And like looking 2 years or 2.5 years back, and I'm sure that my entrepreneurs here can vote for that, it seems like we were expected, or PLG companies were expected to be very kind of rigid about doing only PLG. And it seemed to soften a little bit in the last 1.5 years. Kind of we see kind of more mixed models. I kind of would like to see kind of your thought about the evolution of kind of the concept and kind of real life, which is probably much greater.
Totally. Yeah. I'll be the first to say PLG is not one thing, right? There's not one way to do it. It's a basic principle, right? I'll go back to it. It's the principle about how do you let the product do as much work as possible. But almost every PLG company over time, even if it started purely with individuals discovering the product, even if it grew virally in sort of the truest sense, layers on other ways of engaging users, of engaging customers, of going to market. And so, I think this idea that, okay, if I'm going to build a product-led company, I can't have anyone that talks to customers ever. Or, right, that's ludicrous. It's truly ludicrous. Or, the only way to do this is self-serve, or it has to be consumption-based pricing. Like, all that's bullshit, right? The whole point is to make it as easy as possible for users, primarily, but also customers, to generate the value that you're trying to generate for them. And sometimes that means humans are a really important part of either the beginning, the end of a journey, at a certain point, and almost always over time that means that. If you can delabor it, great, right? You get those exponential effects, you get to become a more profitable business, but just because that can happen doesn't mean it should happen in a particular company or a particular market.
Yeah. So last question, and then I promise to let you ask as well. Consumption. So I had a few companies that were playing with consumption, and it was challenging, okay? When we were going for pure consumptions, we had tons of customers paying our $200 per month, demanding tons of services. It took us a while to understand that just pure consumption isn't working unless you're more mature, you have a real self-serve. So I'm just kind of curious to kind of hear about your experience and kind of your input about the consumption model.
Yeah, consumption is very tricky. I think you can end up in a true what you're describing, like Admiral Akbar moment, it's a trap, right? If you have a consumption-based model where you have customers that can pay you $1, $10, $200, yet the product is not fully self-serve, not just fully self-serve, folks, there's enough documentation or enough community that they can self-diagnose. 1 hour of a person's time at your company, even talking to them, let alone trying to collaborate or solve a problem or learn, that customer is no longer profitable for you. And so I think unless you have, in the early days, a product that really has delabored the acquisition and particularly the support structure, going to a consumption-based model and actually engaging those customers is very challenging. It, I think, shifts the economics of your business upside down. As you get to scale, it's incredibly powerful because you have the ability not just to structure something in a contract that either, depending on the buyer or user, grows organically over time, or you can map it pretty clearly to an enterprise structure that then burns down. So you get an opportunity to have a renewal discussion typically early because you understand what their usage is probably better than they do. Because you understand your product and how it's used often better than a new customer. So I like to think of consumption-based pricing not being a car guy as sort of the F1 vehicle. You know, it's amazing, but you have to know how to use it, right? If you put a standard driver in it, you run into all kinds of operational issues because you're not predicting their usage, getting at certain components, or you haven't delabored essentially the process enough to make it profitable.
Guys, hit him.
Please.
So my question is around the beginning. So one of the many questions that I and other entrepreneurs get to talk about is, okay, so you start at the beginning and you want to build a PLG company. And then, as you said, the trap moment. So first of all, you talk to maybe design partners. And then you want to sell them the product, but then all they ask for are features down the road of the product while you want to bring more people to try the product. So you go like, okay, so I start with design partners, but I end up in a trap because all I want is to get people to use it. And then when you go from the side of people using it, it's oftentimes hard to understand when is the moment to get usage, when is the moment to get, to get them paying. Should it be tiered? Should you start going, start going to enterprise deals from PLG? And you've been in this journey for a very long time. I've seen many companies and saw data of many companies. So my question is around what are some of the common journeys that you saw from point 0 to point 1 million ARR?
So a lot of questions in there. I'll do my best to give, no, it's good, to the rest of the group, whether or not you heard it. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the basic gist is, how do you do the cold start? So what's the balance between getting feedback with design partners, but they have lots of feature requests versus then not getting stuck in that path versus exposing it to more users? How do you think about pricing? So there's a lot in there. Again, I'm a disclaimer, there's not a religious answer to this. It's not black and white. There's not one size fits all. The principle that I would use, two things. One, I think if you get too deep with design partners, we're already kind of off a PLG path from the beginning. Because that is fundamentally, it's an enterprise discussion. You've labored the business in developing your roadmap and getting feedback from your roadmap. I'm not saying you shouldn't go and talk to a lot of folks and deeply understand a problem, but that design partner conversation is already kind of on an enterprise motion from the beginning. So I think that can be a challenging path. In terms of some of the questions around pricing model, where you get pulled, what kind of size deals that you should do, I wish there were a general answer to that question. Your job would be a lot easier. My job would be a lot easier. It's completely dependent, I think, as you probably know, on what you're building and who you're building it for and how they want to buy it. And I think, one of the nice things maybe for folks that come from a technical background, like myself as well, about a product business is hopefully you should be able to get more data and just look at that objective reality and say, this is what's happening. I'm going to take that feedback and I'm going to build it in a much sort of deeper and stronger way versus I know this one person wants to pay for this thing and they're a big customer and so I want to build it. You get to remove a lot of that sort of complexity that comes into the product decision making.
Okay, can I add a question here? So usually when we have a company and then we see the community growing, my recommendation is wait a little bit. Wait until there is like a massive community before you start kind of monetizing. Is it kind of like the right way, or should we try to monetize earlier? This is some of the issues probably Shimon would love to ask.
I actually think if you have the luxury of you've built something differentiated, you're out in front, right? Your community is growing. I would wait. And the reason is actually very much to your question, which is instead of going to some N number of design partners and having those conversations, the community should develop and give you that feedback. right? And so you start getting it from the beginning from sort of a statistical sample of folks that might touch and feel and use the product versus a more idiosyncratic sample set from the sort of folks that you've talked to. That's one of the, again, going back to the open source question, the huge benefits that those companies that have had a project out in the wild for a while have is, yeah, you do want to have some design partner conversations, but the feedback's there. You know a lot of what your product roadmap should be, and you know a wide array of people to purchase it. And so I would wait.
But then they can't raise money. Yeah, it's another
Depends
issue.
from whom, yeah.
So what are the chances that the assumption that a company that already has enterprise sales and started a PLG movement would grow, the idea that the PLG would eventually become a PLS, like product-led sales, and would grow the let's call it the teams, to have more teams, and then to become an enterprise sale at the end. So a go-to-market strategy and not just a PLG motion.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Just to repeat it right, what's the opportunity for a company that's gone down a different go-to-market path, is sales-led or is enterprise sales-led, to introduce PLG and have that be a meaningful part of the go-to-market motion? So one, it's a very hard thing to do, and it's not just a hard thing to do because of changes in the product, but it's an organizationally hard thing to do. If your team is built for, if the way you design product is built around enterprise roadmap, features, delivering against that type of engagement, PLG is comparatively very expensive for very small dollars. And so if you're looking at the ROI of what to do, it's tough. The place where we've seen it be very effective is, instead of expecting it to become its own business line or generate its own core revenue stream, you've seen it be used to dramatically shorten sales cycles. Right? So you don't expect them to go all the way and swipe their credit card, and instead of selling this $100K deal, now you've got somebody paying you $1,000, and that's going to be the future of your business. But man, if you can get somebody into the product, experiencing it, understanding that value for their organization themselves, instead of having to have a BDR call into them, qualify through, set up a demo environment, you might turn a 6-month sales cycle into a 3-month sales cycle. And that's super valuable. Right, for a whole number of reasons. And so that, for companies that have it established, have a successful, whether inside or outside, this sort of sales-led motion has been the most effective way we've seen product-led growth in terms of acquisition impact the company. I think the other lens is retention and growth, right? So potentially you can unlock the ability, instead of having to have a sales conversation for upsell or price against pure value, this is one of the places where moving to a consumption-based model, when you're actually at scale, can work really well. Because all of a sudden, you may be able to delabor your expansion conversations. And so that's another place where we found an enterprise business adding a product-led motion be incredibly effective, and can have a pretty meaningful impact on NRR or net retention. Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, so my question is how some of your best portfolio companies started. And the reason I ask, because I think I see many early stage companies who choose PLG as a main go-to-market approach. Now, I think that there is a confusion, and you are like a growth stage VC. And I think that some of the early adopters, early stage entrepreneurs confuse and find it very hard to make a company growth after the early stage. Now, I wonder how some of the best companies started, because I think that it's very hard to make a company grow and to reach the next stage of funding using PLG. And if we think about it in terms of chances, I think it's much harder, and your chances are much lower to start with PLG and finish, as a big company, or versus starting in a sales led motion and finishing in PLG. So this is why I asked the question, because I think that there are many early entrepreneurs here that using PLG as a main go-to-market approach.
Awesome question. A couple points. So you're absolutely right in that we're not a seed stage investor. 80% of what we do are A's and B's. We invest generally once a product is in market. We're commonly a first investor after a company is out of beta, is starting to generate revenue. So as we think about it, if we go through our most successful companies, it's bifurcated. So you have, let's say, like a Datadog or a Calendly, which were PLG from the beginning, right? You sort of release a product, people discover it, they start using it, they're excited about it, they formally or informally share it with their friends, share it within their company, and the company grows. We also have companies like user testing or HighSpot or Workfront, which were enterprise from the beginning and all the way through their life. So our portfolio has a mixture of go-to-market models from, again, individual user-based to very traditional heavy enterprise sales. I would say in terms of the probabilities, I don't actually see it that way in terms of what your chances are. One thing that is true is as human beings, we like control, right? It feels good. It's good to see an outcome and know you have a direct effect on it. And non-PLG models that are sales-driven, you have a much stronger input-output relationship between the activities that the people at your company do and the growth of your business, fundamentally, right? In a product-led model, it is, if you're, the closer you are toward pure self-serve, pure product-led, the more indirect your activities are. And as a human being, that can be an incredibly frustrating thing. It's also a harder problem to solve, right? Because there is at least one degree of difference between the action you take and the outcome that happens. You have a hypothesis, there's more data to test, and it is harder to get started. There's no question. The difference comes so I would say it is definitely harder to get to a Series A or to get to a Series B. The difference is that if you do, the probability that you get to be a public company or you get to be that scale is dramatically better because of the consistency. It goes back to this point of, again, whether one person, 10 people, or 10,000 people have that product interaction, whether it's the moment of discovery, the moment of engagement, the moment of conversion, the moment of upsell, that actually should improve over time as you improve your product. Versus if you're selling, hopefully, your first 3 salespeople in general are probably better than your first 10, which are absolutely better than your first 100 on average. And so you get effects that allow you to scale more effectively. So it is harder to get to the first step, but I think if you look at the end of the journey, it actually is a slightly higher probability, but it's the weighting is different.
Yeah,
It's a really good question.
I would also add here that it probably takes longer. So when you're planning your budget, you should assume that it's going to take you at least 1.5 years longer. It just takes time.
It was 2 bars when I started. I didn't realize it was going to be like a cell phone, dead. It will almost 100% take longer. Not just probably, I think you're a little soft. It will take longer because you don't have that input-output relationship. At the beginning, you can grow a sales team linearly or quadratically, right? You hire a person, they sell recurring revenue contracts, you layer recurring revenue contracts. It's a quadratic function. It and an exponential function look the same at small scale, but you can control it. The quadratic function becomes linear as you get to scale, the exponential function does not. So it 100% takes longer.
So it means that as a first-timer, I probably should choose a sales-led approach because I'll have better chances to succeed. Although that you say, at the later stage, we'll have better growth and we'll have better metrics. But
I totally understand what you're saying. I think so the question for those that may not have heard it, saying it's a first timer, that means I should definitely take a sales-led approach. And I think it depends on who you are as a human and what you want to do. I think there are different paths. And so if you're really focused on control, consistency, and 100% getting to that Series A as fast as possible, I 100% agree. Sales-led is easier. It is more well-trodden. You have a more direct impact in terms of the thing you do and what happens with your customers. I think if you're someone who is really excited about building an elegant product that people love and are actually emotionally attached to and effusive, the product-led model can be fantastic. Again, there's not a right answer. It depends on who you are, who you're selling to, and what kind of company you want to build.
I'll give you an example of one of my companies. It's an open source guys. One of the guys has thousands of followers in GitHub. It's hard. They're developing an open source companies. They just reached 5,000 downloads per week, which is a lot. Grew very, very quickly. They're burning probably like $80K per month. They have money, I just told him, until 2040. It's an open source company. They behave differently. So I think it's state of mind, who you are, what you want to do, but you need to plan correctly. I understand it's going to take a while.
Which metrics do you look at as a VC investing company?
Great question. Question was, which metrics do we look at as a VC to invest in the company? This relates to sort of the slightly preachy point around exponential functions. So when we're evaluating a business, a lot of the quantitative metrics are going to change radically, right? We are long-term investors, like many venture investors. Our average hold period is about 7.5 years. So sometimes it's short. I think the longest has been 14.5. Sometimes it's a long time. And so we care actually very little about what the business looks like in 6 months or in a year, except to the degree that it is a signal for what the business will look like in 5, in 7, or in 10. And as a result, while sure, we will look at your growth rate, and we will look at the scale of the business, and we will look at the gross margin, and we will look at the early payback period, there's one metric we care about more than any other, and it's retention, and specifically organic net retention. And the reason goes back to the scalability point, which is that because that's generally driven by a user interacting with your product or a customer interacting with your product more than someone on your team interacting with the customer. It's not totally dissociated, but more correlated than, let's say, how fast you're growing, how efficiently you're selling. In our experience, that number in many businesses, not just product-led, but certainly even more in product-led businesses, can be consistent whether you're at 100K in ARR, 100 million in ARR, or $1 billion in ARR because of that interaction. So if we're looking for something quantitative that's going to be a great indicator of the strength of product market fit and also the health of your business model in many, many years from now, that stands out. So that of over all quantitative metrics is the metric that we tend to care the most about.
That means that you're already in the market at least 2 years in order to have retention.
If you're selling annual enterprise contracts, it does. If you have a tool that people can just stop using, right? You can look at it monthly. You can look at it weekly. You can look at it daily. And so when we look at this, we actually don't care what your contract says at all. All we care about is, are people still doing the things that they were doing when they started? Are they doing more of the things you would like them to do? Are they doing less over time? And so you could, when we look at it, well, there's businesses that we've invested in that have been in market for 3 months that sell annual contracts. There's no renewal data, but what there is usage data, and we can understand the behavior. And that's really the thing that we're looking for.
So you don't differentiate between paying user and free user?
So we do differentiate. I think one is decided to the value that they're receiving is worth some level of expense for themselves. The other is not. But in these cases, the model that we'll run, what we'll look to do is say, okay, what is this funnel that's been built? And in an ideal world, let's say you have a smaller number, almost always, of paying users than you might have of free users. So how have those paying users come in? At what volume? At what conversion rates? What's the consistency or lack of consistency between the free users that are coming behind them? And can you actually use that to project the business? And one of the beautiful things I think about product-led businesses is even at sometimes 500,000 of annual recurring revenue, you can build more robust models about the growth of the business, certainly as an outside investor, than some enterprise companies at 5 million or 10 million in ARR, depending just because of the number of individual users or individual customers. And so we actually tend to get conviction and can model it out around these businesses much, much earlier in a product-led model than we can in an enterprise go-to-market. It's a great question.
Last question.
When you're starting, will it be, should you go with a user and enterprise, validating the buyers, and enterprise will pay a lot of it, and users would use it? Will you test both things at the same time, or would you do one thing and then another?
So it's a great question. Let me just give it back to the group, which is when you're starting, Do you want to test if enterprises will pay a lot for your solution and the users will use it? Or do you want to try to just kind of go directly to the users and see if they will use it and pay for it? To me, that gets back to this principle of how do what is the best way to get value the fastest to your customer and user? And it's going to depend on the market, right? If you're selling into something like kind of compliance or GRC, may not be the best opportunity for product-led. Not impossible, it's a little harder. Sometimes if you're selling to folks who like to get their hands dirty, try new things, developers, right, it can be a little bit easier. So I would definitely do a fair amount of research, or you might have an intuition or deep understanding if you come from the domain about the right approach. But sort of to your question, a variety of models work, and some markets are much more well suited given who the customer is and how they would like to purchase things to go through an enterprise model. And some are much better suited to just release a product that individual users can use and bring in and pay for. So there's no golden rule, unfortunately. It's really dependent on the product market.
Yeah, I'll tell you from my experience, when an entrepreneur tells me that they're working on both, usually it means that they are working only on the enterprise version, and they're telling me that they are working on the PLG because they think that I'm for it. So that's the reality, okay?
Looks like there was one last question, so we'll yeah.
What advice might you have for early stage founders during this time in the market, in this market downturn?
Yeah, great question. So what advice might we have for early stage founders in this time in the market or / market downturn, which is real, right? We're transitioning to a new financial cycle. The highs of 2020 and 2021 were exceptionally high, and I think we've probably come back down to something that feels, quote, more long-term normal. There may still be more yet to come, right? And so I think Rona's comment maybe indirectly about the business that has, runway to 2040 might be a little excessive, but having time, because budget cycles, we felt it last year, I think we'll feel it this year, are different. Things that used to be, this is just for, let's say, my engineers are expensive, I can't hire enough of them, they say they like this, great, I'll buy it. Well, if you just cut 10% of your engineering team, you're not gonna have the same perspective. You're gonna be asked for hard dollar ROI. So conversations that used to be easy might be hard conversations, they may not be buying this year. And so, what we're looking at are growth rates are gonna be different, and that's okay, right? Because that kind of thing affects everybody. So ensuring you have enough runway to get to those milestones, whatever those milestones might be for the business, whether it's proving product market fit, whether it's releasing the product, whether it's getting initial revenue, it depends on the company, but ensuring you have the capital to get to those milestones with probably lower expectations than you had about the financial performance of the business this year. That, it's not, it's general advice, but I do think it's the thing that I would focus on. Well, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming.